Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention, maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day everybody, welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. I'm not going to keep you too long with the intro on this one. I have a very special guest today. I've been waiting to get on the show for quite a while. Karen Levy, Cornell Sociologist and author of Data-Driven: Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance, a book you guys have heard me mention about quite a bit. A book I wrote a review on for American Affairs Journal, and I hope you've had a chance to both read my review and read Karen's book. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Karen spent many years studying the effects of surveillance technology on truck drivers in the United States, and her book draws some very interesting conclusions about the effects of this technology, its usefulness, and what it means for the rest of the working class. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this interview. Karen was very generous of her time. She gave me a whole hour, and we went right from the beginning, telling us about her initial interest in truckers, and we got into a pretty deep discussion about the ideas in her book. I'll have links in the show notes to where you can purchase a copy of Data-Driven, where you can read my review of it, and where you can find Karen on Twitter. I've got a few more shows lined up for you guys waiting to be edited. There's lots of content coming. I appreciate y'all listening. And as you know, I don't charge any money for this show. I don't take any ads or sponsors. This is a gift to my fellow drivers and anybody else that wants to listen. I would appreciate it if you could help me get this show to more people. Word of mouth is the best advertising. So please, if you know any truckers or anyone else interested in the business, please pass the show along to them. All right, let's get to Karen Levy. G'day everybody, and welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. I'm Gord. This is my voice. The other voice you're about to hear, I've been waiting to get on this show for a long, long time, and is the voice of someone who's part of what I call the triumvirate of academic writing with regards to truckers and the trucking business. Without any further ado, please welcome Karen Levy, author of Data-Driven: Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance. G'day, Karen.
Hi, Gord. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for making this time. We've had some difficulties getting this organized, but no matter. You are here.
It's happening.
It is, yes. So you wrote this book, which came out in December. I've been speaking about it incessantly. In fact, my speaking about it incessantly resulted in you ending up on the Odd Lots podcast on Bloomberg, which was pretty cool. And in the other direction, somebody noticed that I was speaking about you on my Substack and invited me to a weird academic Zoom salon meeting where I got to sit in and be the only truck driver present. I wrote a review of your book because it was so good and I thought required some examination by somebody in the business. Do we know if any other truckers have written about your book?
That's a good question. Not to my knowledge. There's been some stuff about it in the trucking trade press, but not to my knowledge from somebody who's actively working in trucking as a driver.
Right. The thesis of your book is basically an examination of the effect of surveillance technology on truckers and what the implications are for the rest of the workforce. As I mentioned, and as you have mentioned in the book, this surveillance stuff didn't start with electronic logging devices. It started many, many years ago. But in the 1980s, what were you doing? Where are you from? How'd you get to Cornell? And how did you get into worrying about truck drivers?
Yeah, I mean, in the 1980s, I was certainly not worried about truck drivers because I was ages 1 to 9 during the 1980s and wasn't thinking about much. But I grew up in Indiana, so I was in Indiana then. I had no real, I mean, lots of truckers, of course, drive through Indiana, but I had no connection to trucking in my family or anything. I kind of came to it late. So I grew up in Indiana. I was there for college, and then subsequently I went to law school, became a lawyer. Realized I was more interested in law kind of abstractly as like a social system than I was in actually practicing law. So I continued to get a degree in sociology. And in the course of doing that, I started to think a lot about rules and technology and what it looks like when we have a set of rules that, you know, we maybe don't really follow to the letter or that get enforced sort of, periodically or imperfectly. And then what it might look like if we start to, enforce those rules using some digital technology, which, as I'm sure you know, is like something that certainly has happened in trucking and that happens all over the place, right? We see that, on the internet, and we see it with ticket cameras. And, oftentimes the promise of technology looks like maybe it'll help us enforce rules better. So anyway, I was really interested in that kind of from a conceptual perspective. But I didn't know a place to look at it. Like I wasn't sure kind of like how to examine this empirically. And then one day it's just like life comes at you fast, right? Like one day I was listening to the radio and I heard some story about long haul truckers and what was then called the EOBR mandate. Before it was called the electronic logging device, we called it the electronic onboard recorder, or EOBR, but it's, basically the same thing. And just talking about how truckers were not thrilled about the prospect of this mandate. So I thought all right, well, that kind of sounds like what I'm looking for. So I went, at the time I was in Portland, Oregon. I was doing an internship in Portland. And I didn't have a car. So I took Portland public transportation out to the only truck stop that I could reach via public transportation. And I just tried talking to some drivers to see what it was like and if they would talk to me.
What was the name of that truck stop?
It was called Jubitz. Have you ever heard of Jubitz?
Yes. Oh yeah. Everybody knows Jubitz. That place is legendary.
Do they?
Yep.
It's great. I had a great time out there. I spent lots of hours out there.
It's been around for a while, and it's something like its own tourist destination at this point. Last time I was in the western part of the United States, I believe there's a billboard for Jubitz in Wyoming that says
really?
Jubitz, only another 1,400 miles.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Funny. Well, I didn't know that it was so legendary. I just knew that it was a truck stop I could get to. So I went there and I talked to some guys and I had a great time. I found that truckers were really easy to talk to. They were, very patient with me because I didn't understand anything about the industry. It took a while before I got the lingo down. And it was great. So I was kind of off and running with it after that.
When did you arrive at Cornell?
And I've been here since. Yeah, go ahead.
And how did that work? So you said you got a degree in law. Mm-hmm. You didn't like practicing, but you did practice for a while.
I didn't practice. I worked for a judge. I clerked for a couple of years. But in the course of that, I realized this is not the thing I want to do with my life. And so I got my PhD in sociology.
So did you get your degree at Cornell?
No, it was at Princeton. And then after that, I worked in New York City. I had a postdoc in New York City for a couple of years, did some other stuff. And then I got hired to teach at Cornell in information science, which is a department that kind of studies interactions between people and technology. And I've been here since 2016.
Speaking of legendary truck stops, there's this place that I wish you were around to have studied. In fact, it almost qualifies as before my time because the owner of the place died in 2001 on September 11th, actually. Okay. It's like a honky tonk trucker bar that was next door to a truck stop in Binghamton, New York, which isn't far from you. Yeah, just the characters you would have met at that place. My father met his second wife there. It was somewhat infamous for how shall I put this? Maybe not, the most above board activities, but the owner was a Tennessean, really into country music, very friendly guy, owned his own dump trucks. Yeah.
But it's closed now. It's not there anymore.
Yeah, no, it's long gone.
Hmm.
Someone needs to do a deep dive on
What
Country
was it called?
Bob's. It was called Country Bob's.
Country Bob's.
Yeah, right in Binghamton, right on Route 11 on the south side of town. But anyway, so you arrive at Cornell. You're in the meantime, you're beginning to study truckers, and
Hmm.
not long after you get to Cornell, the ELD mandate comes down. When did the idea for this book come to you, and when did like you decide to take that step to make it a book? Like it's basically
Yeah,
like your book is basically a dissertation,
it
right?
was a dissertation. It was in fact a dissertation.
Okay.
So that was the first. So yeah, so it was 2011 when I like took those first had those first conversations at Jubitz. So that was when I was a student. I went back and talked to my advisor, who actually, it turned out, had been an aspiring songwriter in Nashville in the 70s, and who had spent a bunch of time like sweeping floors in honky tonks and had a real soft spot for, had interviewed some trucking musicians who wrote trucker anthems. And he was really into it. So I pursued the project there, and then put it aside for a couple of years when I first got here, had a couple of kids, did some other things with my life. And then, but I knew I wanted to write it as a book, right? Because a dissertation is valuable for what it is, right? Like you're proving yourself to a discipline and you're establishing that you can apply the theories from that discipline to a new empirical research site. But I felt like there was more to the story that I wanted to say. And I wanted to say it in a way that was going to be legible to the public and not just to the three sociologists who had read it. So I like, a lot of the book is based on the dissertation. There's a lot of commonality between them, and a lot of the initial research I did before actually the mandate was mandated, or before the mandate went into effect in 2017. So I started interviewing truckers in 2011. I interviewed a bunch of people and did a bunch of field work up through around 2014, 2015. And then I went back into the field a bit more after that, but the bulk of the work was then. And part of that was strategic, right? Because I wanted to see what does this transition look like, right? And I didn't only want to see what happened when the ELD was mandatory. I wanted to see, like, what does paper logging look like, and how is it that people kind of interact around that, or how is it that they negotiate the needs that they face, or their relationships with managers, things like that, under both systems. And so, by looking at this moment of transition where some companies were already using ELDs and some weren't, that like let me get at some of that variation in a way that was useful.
Right. And at the beginning of the show, I mentioned I consider your book part of a triumvirate. And for my listeners, I'm going to name all three of them, two of which you reference heavily in your book. The first is Sweatshops on Wheels by Wayne State economics professor Michael Belzer, who has also agreed to come on the show next month. Also, former truck driver and Teamster, and Steve Viscelli, another sociologist at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Steve seems to have taken some kind of injury here as of late and has been unavailable. However, all those books are really good. And there's a fourth book I'm going to throw in, maybe not as like germane to trucking specifically, but tangentially related. There's this like weirdo postmodernist guy who also does lots of podcasts and talks to all the dissident weirdos that I'm interested in. His name's Thad Russell. He wrote a book also published on September 11th, 2001, the same day Country Bob died in an accident. And it's called Out of the Jungle, Jimmy Hoffa and the Remaking of the American Working Class. Also a dissertation. That's how he got his PhD. Yeah, Russell's book. Did you reference Russell's book at all?
No, I don't think. I think you had maybe mentioned it to me before, but I have not read it.
Right. No, it's really good. And I mean, I don't know how germane it is to the surveillance stuff, other than that some of the only legal fight that's come back against the surveillance stuff has been from the Teamsters, in isolated cases, right? So the Teamsters Union in Quebec fought the imposition of driver-facing cameras in the trucks of a company called Cisco, who are a very large food distribution outfit. They're all over North America, possibly the world, and they fought that back. So I mean, and there's been lots of discussion, again, outside of the surveillance stuff, about trying to get the working class back on its feet, make unions more relevant again. And I think people should read Russell's book. to understand the philosophy of how Jimmy Hoffa operated. It's really interesting. He opens the book with a comparison between Jimmy Hoffa and Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs being the very famous socialist organizer, the guy who went to jail for protesting conscription to World War One. But like Debs and they were born both in Indiana. Eugene Debs and Jimmy Hoffa were born 7 miles apart in the same neighborhood of Indiana. But Debs was a super ideological, progressive man of his time. And Jimmy Hoffa didn't finish school at all and was very much blue collar populist from the bottom up. And one of the pictures that Russell paints in his book of Jimmy Hoffa was that Hoffa was antagonistic to other unions like the AFL-CIO. He hated communism, hated socialism, loved America, supported Richard Nixon, kind of a Trumpian figure before Trump, as it were. And, which is hilarious given that Hoffa built the largest labor union America has ever seen by not being a commie shitbag. So, yeah, anyway, it's a good book and everybody should go read it. I think Hoffa probably, if he was alive, I don't follow the Teamsters enough. Maybe you do. I'm like, do you have any indication, like having now published your book and the research you did for it, like, is there any pushback to this imposition of all this surveillance stuff from the like wider labor movement? Like, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm curious for your take on this too. So in my conversations with truckers and I have talked to a couple folks involved in Teamsters, but by and large, right, as I'm sure you know, right, the unionization rate in trucking is like incredibly low. I think we're talking like low single digits. It's hard to get good numbers, but maybe 5%, probably lower than that. Coming down from like, I think it was something like 70% union or something back in the 70s, like one of the most unionized industries. So that in itself is like a stunning change. But surprising, maybe not surprisingly, a lot of truckers I've talked to, I've asked them this question about like, well, what do you think about unions? Why, what would you ever unionize? Like, is this something that comes up in your life? And I've been met with almost universal antipathy towards the idea of unionization, right? And when I've asked people about it directly, folks have tended to say things about, the constraints that unionization might pose for their capacity to, direct their labor independently, which I think is really primary for truckers. Obviously there's been, as you point out, right, like the Teamsters were incredibly powerful in their time for good and ill, right? Like there's plenty that was questionable about the way Hoffa ran the union, but also accomplished like some real, I think, genuine good for the working class. So it's interesting to me that, maybe I guess it's that it's been 40 years since unions have had a strong role in trucking, but I have not heard a lot of long haul folks talk about the prospect of that. Where there has been some more, I think, collective action of a sort is with OIDA, the Owner Operators Association, which is not a union, but is an interest group that does some of the things that unions might do, right? Like it doesn't do all of those things, but it does do things like, for example, bring legal challenges on behalf of its membership, which is something that we might expect a union to do as well. And OIDA has been really active in resisting surveillance and tracking and the electronic logging device mandate specifically. We obviously have that mandate, so that those challenges haven't been ultimately successful, but I think did delay the onset of the ELD quite significantly, right? Like they got some prior FMCSA rulemakings tossed out and have, I think represented the interests of their members really well. So that's not, again, like that's not the same as the Teamsters or another union, but I do think that's where you see some of that energy now. I'm curious though, Gord, for your take, like on the question of unionization, what's your view among like you or the folks that you know in the industry about the prospect of unions as kind of a way forward for truckers?
Well, there's the messaging is mixed, and some of that messaging is informed, unfortunately, by the bipolarity of our political cultural zeitgeist and zombie Reaganism. And there's a lot of people who just spent too many years listening to AM radio and doorknobs like Sean Hannity and Michael Medved and whoever the fuck telling them that, like, unions are bad, unions are bad, unions are bad. I want to say I'm ambivalent, but like, the problem, as you know, which, okay, I'm going to go on a minor tangent here, but then I'm going to come back to your question.
Okay.
As you know, you made abundantly clear in your book, and it's also true, is that truckers is a male dominated industry, right? Like 95% of truck drivers per United States Bureau of Labor Statistics are men. 78% of them are white men, whatever the hell that means. And, it's the number one occupation for dudes in like 29 states. It's very male dominated. Unfortunately, and this became very apparent to me while trying to defend the Freedom Convoy in Canada, most unions now represent like more, they lean more public sector unions. And unions also, their leadership now tends not to draw from the shop floor. Unions have become professionalized, and in their management, they draw, and don't take this personally, they draw from the cathedral. They draw from universities, academics, people who are professionally trained typically run unions. They're not the people that like work their way up, as happened back in the day. So part of this resistance to unions on the part of truck drivers is this like cultural dissonance between the people who run unions and then the stated sort of concern of the leadership, which today, because of the caste of people that run it, is mostly identity politics and whatever the Democratic Party tells them, and a whole lot of nonsense that doesn't mean anything to the average guy in Nebraska somewhere, right? So like you have that in your way. And then, like, again, as you said, the Teamsters are only 5% and they're sort of built around the LTL market. I've only ever worked at one place where they tried to unionize the joint, and I had an internal dialogue about whether or not to sign the card, because the Teamsters tried to unionize the place I hauled fuel at in Toronto, and the place I hauled fuel, they had like this weird rate structure where you had like a sort of base minimum hourly rate, and then you would get extra for extra loads, extra kilometers, all the rest of it. And I was making hella money cranking out loads. And there was a certain percentage of the people that worked there that were just, they showed up and stood around for an hour before they got in their truck to complain about stuff. And it's like, no, man, I'm getting in the truck. I got to go. I got fuel to haul. So there's a lot of guys who are in my position that are like, I want to work. I want to make money. I don't want to stand around and BS about stuff. So between the sort of cultural afflections of the people who run unions, plus the perception that they will cut into the wages of the people who want to go, you're going to have some pushback on unionization. Mm-hmm. However, now that I've studied the history of Hoffa somewhat, and we also, the problem today in 2023 is the forces that have screwed the American working class are so powerful, so pervasive, so widespread, so ingrained into the culture that I don't know how we're going to correct it without them. So my take is I'm torn. I would actually like to see more organization, more labor activism. Can that happen under union leadership as it exists today? Not a goddamn chance. They all need to be cleaned out, just like our entire political class needs to be cleaned out. That's my opinion. You can interpret what I mean by cleaned out any way you want, but like, and I don't want to say that that's representative of all truckers, but I would think a few of them agree with me.
Gotcha.
You write this book. It's excellent. One of my main parallels when I first heard about you and was suggested this book, one of your chapters is called The Slope. I think it's chapter 7. And there's a lot out there in the zeitgeist about autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. And I named my Substack Autonomous Truckers, kind of to play on that term. and because I'm somewhat skeptical of all this. But the thing that you nail really well, and you called it the slope, right? What happens to all of us truckers between now and our benevolent robotic future? I really appreciated the fact that like you gave some cause for concern to the human element to this, and like how are we going to be treated between now and then?
Mhm.
Describe for me your impression of the slope.
Yeah, so thank you for saying that about that part of the book. That was definitely that was the most recent part of the book I did, and I started to work on it because I had written this dissertation version of the book, and over time, like around 2016, 2017, like it became very clear that autonomous vehicles and specifically autonomous trucks were like emerging as part of the story. Like nobody was talking about that when I started the work. Like it just wasn't on, it certainly wasn't on my radar. I didn't get the sense it was on truckers' radar. Just like what, it wasn't a public thing in the same way that it was 6, 7 years later. And it became really clear that like this was entering the scene, right? And if I was going to talk about trucking and technology and labor, it was impossible to talk about that without talking about what might happen to truckers if, as you say, robots or autonomous trucks like come to replace trucking labor. And my initial concern, and this was based really largely on reporting at the time and both academic work and I think just stories in the media about fears around labor replacement, the same kind of stories you see today. Like I think you could open up any major paper over the last week and find something about ChatGPT and its impact on labor. Like we have this conversation just about every 10 years, almost by clockwork, when there's some big new tech advance that seems like it might subject some large group of workers to replacement, right? Because it makes them replaceable, or it becomes cheaper to just automate. Even if the automation is less good, it becomes cheaper to automate those jobs away. And so this is this conversation we have periodically, and oftentimes kind of the shape of that conversation is like a cliff, right? So in the book I talk about the cliff and the slope, and this idea of almost like a robot apocalypse where 2 million long haul truckers are suddenly out of work. And in the book I say like, well, I'm less worried about that, and I describe instead how I think the short to medium term impacts of automation and artificial intelligence are not the replacement of work, but a change in what work looks like and how people are compelled to sort of integrate their own labor with these systems. And in the book, I go to great lengths to explain why I think this is likely to be the case rather than this sort of wholesale replacement. But like the broad strokes of it are first that the technology isn't that great yet, right? And like probably won't be that great, maybe ever, but certainly not over the next 10 to 20 years. And there are other reasons too, right? Including things like people's general reticence around autonomous vehicles. Like most of the public is not comfortable with them. There's a lot of kind of patchworkiness about state regs about autonomous vehicles, like a lot of stuff that just has to get worked out. So what does that slope look like, right? Is kind of like the focus of that chapter of the book. And what I think it looks like actually is not that automation supplants surveillance or substitutes for surveillance, but instead that automation just like looks like more surveillance. And I can explain briefly what I mean. If you look at the systems that ELDs integrate with, right, like I'm sure your listeners know that an ELD, as it's defined by the federal regulations, tracks some stuff, right? But it doesn't track as much as what those systems actually ultimately do, right? So like the feds want your location and whether you're moving, and that's almost it, right? Like not too much more beyond that. But because these systems tend to include a lot of other stuff, it's almost as though the Fed said everyone has to buy a phone that makes phone calls. But in practice, like you can't really buy a phone that makes phone calls. You have to buy a phone that makes phone calls and texts and gets you online and all these other things, right? And that's kind of like what's happened with the ELD. So the ELD now is really like a black box, a system that tracks a whole bunch of other information about what drivers are doing, like fuel efficiency and hard brakes and speed. And now often includes like, this is emerging stuff, right? But driver facing cameras, much of which is like augmented by AI to detect signs of fatigue, like eyelid flutter or, your head nodding, stuff like that. As well as, and this is again, emerging, right? So this is not maybe what the median trucker finds, but I think this is what I see happening on the slope over the next few years. The emergence of wearables and biometrics that detect fatigue via things like brain waves or heart rate, or other kind of biophysical indicators. So what this looks like is not replacement of a laborer. What it looks like is like hybridization of a human being and the machine. And to
As
me,
you,
like that's
as
such a
you,
different story, right? Like that's just
yeah, as you described it, robo truckers.
robo truck, right? Which, to give credit where credit is due, is something I got from Landline. So Landline, the trucking magazine, this great cartoonist named Mo Paul. Big shout out to Mo, who's been awesome and let me reproduce some of his cartoons in the book. And he has this great cartoon of the robo trucker that accompanies this article in Landline from 2017, where they talk about the proliferation of some of these devices.
Right. I want to bring the slope to today,
Yeah,
which is April 25th, 2023.
it is.
And we've now gone through the COVID regime. We've gone through, as I describe in my review of your book for American Affairs Journal. Thank you, Julius Krein, for having me. The multiple phases of Schrodinger's trucker, where we went through being the most essential of essential workers, terrorists in the eyes of Justin Trudeau, may his soul burn in hell for eternity, and an afterthought in the minds of the tech bros who are building all of this technology. But we're seeing right now in freight markets some pretty vicious down pricing. There's loads being put on load boards for 90 cents a mile. There's all kinds of various truckers who are hauling things at a loss just to keep their trucks moving. It's been estimated that we are now at like 28% in excess capacity of what was required before COVID hit. And things are looking really rough for, the financial prospects of truckers right at the moment. And I just wonder where all of this surveillance technology and security theater, as it were, affects how we get back out of that. One of the bugaboos, one of the things I like to talk about a lot is the oversupply of truck drivers, and this is something Vishelli spoke about in the Big Rig, was that we have this churn and retention problem with drivers themselves. And because companies just don't want to pay us, they find it easier to keep training new people. And, there's a bunch of different places that the trucking industry grabs new people from. Some of it is the CDL mill system. I just interviewed a guy who lives in Maryland, works for like a state sort of employment agency, funnels people into truck driving schools. The military gives money grants for people to get their license. And then, there's this issue with like indentured servitude, where unfortunately, and this might not sound politically correct, but it's the truth. Certain recent immigrant communities get a hold of their hombres back in whatever country they come from. They bring them to America and basically chain them to a truck, as exposed in this really excellent article in USA Today a few years ago about port truckers in Los Angeles. There was a major investigation into this practice in Canada, and Canada's national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, back in 2019, which showed that trucking companies run by the Indian community in British Columbia were basically bringing poor, illiterate guys from India to come drive trucks in Canada. Plus the government giving money willy-nilly to people to come drive. And it's like, okay, so if you're already a person who's either a member of the lumpen proletariat, or you come from a different culture, let's say you came here from India or El Salvador or wherever, and you come to America, you get thrown in a truck, and now there's a camera watching you and there's an ELD. Other than other Western countries, I don't believe there's any such thing as this surveillance. Like, this surveillance is a very Western thing. Am I correct?
A good question. I mean, I don't have a great sense for it. I think it aligns with Western managerial notions of efficiency and productivity above all else, right? So, like, you talked about kind of the macro conditions in the industry now and the kind of, really thin margins on which companies run and the sort of race to the bottom for productivity. And that, has historically in trucking and in other industries and maybe continually, the people who suffer when faced with those conditions are labor, right? Are the people who are actually doing the work. And that can happen, I think, in a few different ways. Like one has to do with what you were just talking about, right? Which is this idea. I don't know if you've read like Harry Braverman, but he's like a writer from the 1970s who wrote this really wonderful book on labor and technology. And he talks a lot about the idea of de-skilling, right? That you like make labor fungible. So like the goal of management in this telling is like you take the knowledge that's in the head of the worker and you break processes down so that nobody now knows how to make a whole car, right? Everybody knows how to make like 1/100th of the car. And what that does is it reduces the bargaining power of any individual laborer, and it makes them readily replaceable, right? So like all you have to do is teach a guy how to do the 1/100th of the thing. And I think there's an analog. I mean, trucking is a little bit different because it's not like a warehouse or a factory process, right? But you can see sort of analogs in what you're talking
I
about.
can
Or the
see.
more tightly you supervise people, the more you don't really care how much skill they have coming in, right? You just are going to micromanage.
Right. Might I share another anecdote on that?
Sure.
And this is
Sure.
purely from my own personal experience. And it might sound elitist, and maybe it is, but since I've in the last few years, so I went away traveling. I've driven truck in Canada, New Zealand, Australia. I've got 26 years of experience. I've driven the biggest trucks in the world in Australia. I've hauled on the ice. I've run mountains in New Zealand. I've done all the things. I have a perfect driving record. I haven't got a ticket in a big truck since 2005. You know, I'm what they advertise as being like, hey, you're the guy we want to come work for us. You're a safe driver. You haven't gotten any accidents. You're great. However, that's worked against me in my experience since moving to New York from Canada. And I think it's because, as you say, they want it compartmentalized. They want the lowest common denominator. Whereas I understand what my value is. I am also unwilling to take any shit from management and have them tell me how things are going to be. I think that works against people like me and in my position who have all this expertise and experience. And in the various podcasts you've been on, you've described this as like the guys who get turned off by the surveillance are the people with decades of experience and who are the least likely to get in accidents are going to say the hell with this with being surveilled. Well, in tandem with this surveillance is basically an utter disregard now for our experience. Like there's a local sawmill group here that I've tried to apply to 5 times in the last 5-6 years, and they just won't talk to me at all. And I think that there's this thing going on where certain trucking entities have gotten so used to the CDL mill complex, the new immigrants abused by the industry, and the churn, the retention problem, that they've become so accustomed to how that's driven down wages and driven down, their operating costs, that to actually hire the person they would ostensibly want to hire, somebody who's highly experienced, safe, fuel efficient, ticks all the boxes, their stated preferences are not reflected in how they actually choose the people to drive. They want the cheapest shit they can get their hands on, which ain't me.
Yeah. No, I think that totally tracks with what I'm saying. And I mean, just to be clear, like this is a dynamic that unfolds across lots of industries, right? So like I have a much smaller scale project than this book on trucking, but like I have one paper that I wrote on retail work, right? People who work in retail environment. And one, like something that happens in retail too is something very similar, right? So you take people who like, especially people who work on commission, right? Who like know their customer base, go the extra mile, like know this shit, right? Like know the people who you ostensibly want, right? Like the expert. And what you do is you create a system where you force those people to like upload all their data, right? So like high-end retailers do this now. It's a process called clienteling. It used to be that clienteling was like this person-driven practice where like somebody who's worked in the store for 20 years like has a book of business, right? Like has a set of clients. And now the whole point is that you like extract that knowledge from their heads so that they can no longer use it as a bargaining chip, right? They can't argue for a raise. You can hire basically anyone to do the work because all they have to do is like read what's in the software, right? To know what somebody's favorite color is or when their birthday is or what their size is or whatever, all that stuff that the person needs to know in their head, all the relational stuff. And so like this is, I think, just a way in which managers across lots of industries, in the name of often efficiency, right, or productivity or locating waste in a process, end up participating in this process that, like you said, right, like does this de-skilling and leads to this, wage compression for folks, who are actually doing the work. Like it's not surprising that it happens because it's something that's been happening for a long time. But I do think it's interesting that it's happening in a context like trucking, where for such a long time, I think the type of expertise that's been valued in trucking is people who is like road knowledge, right? Like people who really know what it is, like what you were talking about, right? You've had all these experiences in lots of different environments, right? Like you take on a lot of personal risk, right? Like that's the kind of expertise that, like you said, we say we want behind the wheel. And then I think the public probably, if asked, would say that they want, but then ultimately, economically, that's not what we reward.
Right. I wrote a Substack recently addressing this. I called it the idea behind it was that truckers had won the race to the bottom, and well, I received some criticism for this, just because like there's always rule proving exceptions, right? There are trucking jobs out there that do pay six figures. They are the exception. They are the minority. There's lots that don't, and I get these like weird boomer conservatives saying, well, everything's a choice, man. You don't just have to work there. Well, life ain't that simple. And, God bless my boomer conservative listeners who want to go on about free markets all the time. They don't have very much to say about the sort of like corporate welfare that sends people to trucking, or like the regulatory frameworks that like have basically, turned it into not Smokey and the Bandit. Actually, something I wanted to ask you about, another tangent here. You have described trucking culture as based on these old stereotypes and tropes about independence, the sort of virile masculine man driving the truck. And, even though trucking does skew very heavily male, one of the arguments I made in my review of your book is that we've been emasculated. That doesn't exist anymore. Like that culture, that portrait was caught in a certain time, which was basically 40 plus years ago. And now I don't believe that exists anymore. And I believe our treatment as such belies that it doesn't exist anymore because, as I said, they don't value that, I'm not saying like I'm some virile Burt Reynolds like character, but like if you want the boxes ticked as an employer for what you want out of a driver, A, I've had a hard time getting jobs, and B, they all pay shit and nobody wants to actually give me the money that would approximate what that stated preference is. So like, where do you think that went? And like, do you think maybe, I'm not trying to say you like had it in error here, but like, is that stereotype like it's out of date? Like, how do we like move past that to discuss the reality of today?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. So, right. So I talk about those, refer to it as like cultural iconography, right? So like the suggestion is not that most truckers or any truckers are Burt Reynolds or Chris Christopherson or any of the other, like, like obvious for Sylvester Stallone, right? Like there's lots and lots of virile men who portray truckers on screen and in song. And I talk about, there's a really good book by a historian named Shane Hamilton called, I think it's called Trucking Country. I might be getting the name wrong, but I talk about it in the book. Right, and he spends a lot of time talking about the relationship between like popular music and trucking. And I describe all that stuff in the context of describing the history of the industry, right? So in the chapter, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, where I talk through kind of, the genesis of the hours of service regulations and deregulation via the Motor Carrier Act in 1980, right? Just trying to like tell the story of trucking as an industry largely for people who are unfamiliar. And my goal in doing that is not, of course, to suggest that those are current, right? That's the state of things. But I do think there's something to drawing from those in understanding historically what truckers' self-conception has been. And a lot of people I talked to, they didn't say like, well, I'm just like Burt Reynolds. But what they would say is stuff like, is they would say tons of stuff about freedom, right? If like almost to the person, when I would ask truckers, like, why do you do what you do? Like, what got you interested in this, right? The same kind of questions you asked me to start this. They would say, like, I didn't want someone looking over my shoulder. Like, I wanted to make my own decisions. I wanted to see the country, right? I wanted to do my work on my own terms, like some variation of that. And I think that's obviously not created by movies like Smokey and the Bandit, but I do think those capture what used to be kind of the ethos or the culture that help to kind of supplement. And this is something that happens in a lot of jobs that are really hard and really risky, is that a culture develops alongside the folks who are like capable of doing that work that emphasizes this kind of pride in its difficulty. And to your point about kind of does that remain right in the light of the ELD mandate or the surveillance technologies pervading trucking? I think we agree on this. I think one of the arguments I'm trying to make in the book is that part of the reason that this stuff hits so hard in trucking is precisely because of kind of the historical nature of the workforce and its masculinity and its emphasis on stamina and its emphasis on self-knowledge and its autonomy, right? Same kinds of things that you write about. And that's why they like really come as an affront in a way that maybe they don't hit as hard in service industries or in like other contexts where there's like less of an occupational identity. I mean, it's really striking to me. And one thing I really liked about getting to know truckers, like a question I get a lot about my book is like, is there anything special about truckers? Or are you just telling a story that you could tell just as easily about any group of workers? I think it definitely is the case that workplace surveillance is emerging across lots of different industries, not just trucking. But one reason I like telling the story about truckers, and one reason I've really appreciated getting to know folks who work as truckers, is just because the identity of being a trucker is unlike most occupational identities, right? A lot of people don't define themselves by where they work. And a lot of truckers, this is not to essentialize truckers. Truckers are many things to many people, and they have families and they have social lives, and they have lots of other dimensions, but there is such a strong identity associated with doing that work. And that I think is really striking and makes it like all the more acute, right? That this is an industry that's been struck so hard by surveillance technology. If you disagree, I'd love to know it though.
I think you're correct. I mean, I've been in the business long enough now to have a certain amount of self-reflection, and back in the day before podcasts and the internet and whatnot, a lot of drivers, because of the nature of their time behind the wheel, like in that sort of shoulder area where like cell phones were still a thing, but the internet wasn't. We used to get these call-in radio shows, and often the callers were truck drivers, and they'd always say, well, I'm a truck driver. Like the first thing I would always say, well, I'm a trucker. Like that was the first thing out of their mouths, as if like it was meant to contextualize the rest of whatever it was they had to say. I'm guilty of this as well. My first Twitter handle, like 5 accounts ago, was called Token Blue Collar Friend, which was kind of a play on the fact that, like, my wife's a teacher. Her mom used to work at Cornell, and her dad, they all have master's degrees. And I would go traveling overseas, did the whole backpacker thing, hostels, whatever. And like working class people were the minority. It was always like, I'm a designer, I'm a lawyer, I'm an engineer, I'm some kind of information tech person or a professional, or my parents are rich or something, and I always find myself in these milieus of people who are not me, and because I grew up in a blue collar family and I drove truck, that kind of like, it was forced on me, and it was self-selected at the same time. And I think, that's something a lot of us, I don't know if I would say we would struggle with it, but it is definitely part of the job. And I think a component of that is the sort of isolation that's intrinsic to the gig. You spend an awful lot of time by yourself when you're on the road. And, one of my aunts, hi, Auntie Irini, I hope you listen to this, said something to me when I was a whole lot younger, which has stuck with me to this day and is very true, and I think applies to other drivers, is that, too much time in your own head can be a problem. And how that problem manifests itself, again, can be taken to the macro, where we have all this like weird identity stuff, and then that becomes a culture and all the rest of it. So on the slope and on identity and on all this culture stuff, like, one of my bugaboos is like the human element. You're placed within what some of us like to call the cathedral. You're a sociologist, you're a lawyer, you work at Cornell, you're attached to all of these people in society who are managers or perceive themselves to be such. And, we also have the like tech people who are selling the ELDs and selling the autonomous vehicles and doing the marketing for it. And one of the things I want those people to realize and not forget is the human element. And I think that comes across in your book is like, again, you titled one chapter The Slope. You tried to be very, tender and careful in how you approached my fellow truckers and how you talked about us. But like at the same time, there's like the cold, hard reality of economics, the disconnection of the political system, and with all of this new technology everywhere, like people are going to forget the human element. People are going to forget that like we're people. There's a million things that happen out here in material reality land you cannot see behind a laptop, you cannot experience from an office. And like, what's your sense being in the position you have, having written this book, having done the research you've done, and being in between these two worlds? Like, is there anything you think you can do to like get it through their heads that like we're still dealing with people here? Or do you have suggestions for us to make that message louder or more understood?
That's a really good question. It's a tough one. Geez, Gord. I mean, do I think I have some like, I don't have like a red phone where I can be like, you know what we should do differently. Like it doesn't quite work like that. But I do think this is, the book has only been out for a little while, but I think one thing that has been heartening to me, take this for what you will, and maybe you'll think this is nothing. I get the sense that there is some interest among folks in policymaking who study, like I mostly hang out with tech policy people, right? And like some of them are, yeah, I mean, like people who, certainly like in Washington under the Biden administration, the Office of Science and Tech Policy has been really active, and obviously they work on all kinds of stuff, and they haven't worked on something involving truckers per se, but they think a lot about kind of the impact, like you said, right? The human element of technology, the way that algorithmic systems or digital systems impact labor and intersect with civil rights and things like that, right? And I do feel really heartened when I am part of those conversations because I get the sense that people are really interested in policy. How do I want to put this? Policy making that gets to root causes. Of course, like I'm not a Pollyanna about this stuff, and I know that like people saying the right things is a far cry from actual like material on the ground change. But you do have to start with people at least acknowledging issues, right? And I get the sense that, there has previously been a lot of kind of promise associated with technology as a way to solve problems that are social or economic or political in nature. And I do get the feeling that like that ship has kind of sailed and that people are starting to come to terms with the idea that like, you know what, if you have tired and underpaid truckers and your concern is about public safety, it's not going to cut it to just like police harder, right? To use technology like a little, like to really like bear down on the people who have the least power to change anything and expect a fundamental
okay,
shift.
so I want to bring you some examples where I think like, okay, so maybe some people realize that like you can't just tech harder, but
Yeah.
they're trying to impose a unique electronic identifier on every commercial vehicle in the United States. The
Yeah.
FMCSA is trying to remove the exemption for trucks built before 1999. Like they're doubling down on all of this stuff through their
Mm-hmm.
legislation they're proposing. So like
Mm-hmm.
you might be speaking with wonks who are starting to rethink this stuff, but the FMCSA, the DOT, clearly they're still going forward with more surveillance. And one of the,
Yeah.
one of the great points you make in your book is that, and you said this to Joe and Tracy on Odd Lots, is like the ELD mandate produced none of the objectives with regards to safety as it said it was going to. And they still haven't done anything to work on the incentives. They haven't done anything to do anything about detention. I mean, there's been studies done, and after all these years of COVID, supply chain problems. Well, there's like a transportation and logistics sub school at MIT that showed at any given time 40% of America's trucks are stuck at a dock somewhere. There's been studies shown that there's a high correlation between detention time and the likelihood a driver gets in an accident. Everything about this surveillance technology is punishing us, punishing the truck owners and specifically the drivers, despite all of the evidence. Like, they're not doing anything about the economic incentives. They're not doing anything to like stop the flow of new drivers, and new drivers are overrepresented in the amount of accidents. Like, no matter how many statistics, no matter how much fact, logic, like everything shown to these guys, they keep doubling down on surveillance. So like, what's the disconnect here? Why is it that like their go-to solution is more surveillance in the face of evidence showing that none of that works?
I mean, I think you know the answer, right? Which is that, right? I know you know the answer, which is that is easy and doesn't disrupt entrenched interests, right? Like, it is very easy to just, like you put it, tech harder, even if, right, even in the face of countervailing evidence that suggests like, well, maybe this actually isn't going to get us where you want to go, because the real changes in the industry would be economically disruptive, might lead to more, and this is the argument, right, which I know you're well versed in, right, might lead to higher costs for consumers, which maybe they should. But those types of things are politically unpopular. They are going to face, lobbying interests that are very powerful on the industry side, right? Like, why it is, right? That's the easy thing to do. And, obviously
there might, there might be some normies. There might be some people listening to this because you're going to go and blast it out on Twitter and you're going to inform all of your academic friends that I actually spoke with one of the objects of my study. And some people might listen to this who don't actually know what's going on. So it bears repeating.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe I'm just an optimist or naive, but I do think I am noticing in like the whatever it is, 12 years since I've been paying attention to the industry, that the rhetoric does seem to be changing a bit. I agree with everything you said. Everything you said is factually right about the doubling down and, revisit the FMCSA kind of pushing a little harder on pre-2000 trucks and all that stuff is obviously happening. But I do notice a change in some of the rhetoric, right? Like Buttigieg, I write about this in the book, I think, or maybe this happened after, right? Like Buttigieg has defended ELDs, but he has also said some stuff, which I don't think Elaine Chao didn't say. I don't think anyone previously at a DOT has said, around kind of like, we can't just treat this as like a leaky bucket problem, right? We can't just keep like getting more people their CDLs and letting the industry chew them up and spit them out. Like, that's not going to solve our problem. Again, one speech where he says that is not the same as policy that instantiates it. But I never heard that before a couple years ago, right? And that gives me like a glimmer of hope that there is some prospect for more wholesale change that focuses on root causes. I mean, maybe that's naive, and maybe we can rehab this discussion in 10 years and see if anything changed. But I don't know. I have to be hopeful about something.
No, and I appreciate your positive vibes. So so you've published this book. I believe you mentioned you're working on some other projects involving possibly the wider implications for the working class. So like, one of the things about data driven is that, yes, it's about truckers. Yes, it examines our position on the leading edge of this surveillance technology, but like, there are implications for other sections, a lot of other sections of the working class. And so what are those implications? What are other parts of the working class who are seeing all of this stuff, and where do they go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you'd actually probably be hard pressed to find a segment of labor that is not, experiencing some of these transformations, although not always at the speed or intensity that truckers are. But, certainly folks working in, on the factory floor or in warehouse labor or in the service sector. I was just in Vegas not long ago talking to some folks who work with labor unions with casino workers, talking about the ways in which digital technologies have impacted their work, housekeepers, Up to and including, like, there was a piece in the New York Times a few months ago about productivity monitoring, where like one of the people they talked to was like a hospice chaplain, like somebody who goes and like, did you read? You would like this article. Um, Somebody who goes and like spends time counseling people in their final moments on Earth, and how she had to deal with this point system that like incentivized her to spend less time with more people. I mean, like it really it's happening across the board, right? Including in finance and medicine and law and industries that we might have thought were like immune from some of these things. But it's coming, right? And so in a sense, people sometimes say like, oh, our trucker's like a canary in the coal mine for this stuff. I think in some sense, yes, right? Like these are old dynamics. The interests of managers are not so different from what they were at the like advent of the Industrial Revolution, right? Just like productivity, efficiency, cutting out waste. But the means by which we can do that have drastically expanded, right? Owing to mobile technology and biometrics and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of see that as being some more of the same. The Department of Labor has made some I don't know if this is something that you followed, but has made some interesting moves recently, trying to kind of rein in workplace surveillance under like the theory that it might impinge on workers' rights to unionize or to discuss unionization. Right, that if like your employer has access to all of your communications with other workers, that can effectively chill the right to unionize, right? So like that's the tool that's the hammer that they have, so that's the hammer that they're using to attack workplace surveillance. But I'm hopeful that there will be some more policy moves that will be even broader, right, or will affect more workers than that.
Okay. Karen Levy, thank you very much for joining Voice of Gord. Thank you for writing your book. Thank you for showing this interest in my industry and the people that drive it. I speak with a few other people in trucking, and maybe that self-selects because of the crew I hang out with, but like a lot of folks have heard of your book now. And again, you've done some trucking media stuff, but I think more people need to read it. I think more people need to understand the bigger picture thing, what's happening here. And I highly recommend it to everybody. Data-driven truckers, technology, and the new workplace surveillance. Go straight to Princeton University Press, correct?
Yep, that'll do it. Thank you so much, Gordon. Thanks back to you and to truckers generally. I've been faced with such generosity from folks in the industry, and I'm just incredibly grateful for people sharing their stories with me.
Yeah, no, well, I think most of us will shoot the shit with anyone, and if that person happens to be a professor at Cornell, all the better. All right, thank you, Karen. Way of the road.
All right, thanks a lot, Gordon.